There have been a lot of gimmicks used in wrestling throughout the years, and so, for that reason then, it should come as no surprise that not all of them have been great. No, some have been outright bad in fact. But while from time to time a bad gimmick will signal the death knell for a performer's career, there are those who have been able to recover from such a thing. And those are the people we want to talk about today as it happens, the few who made a major gimmick upgrade. And where better to start than with the Tazmaniac and his transformation into Taz. Yes, well, it's easy to look back on ECW now and assume that Peter Sinersha was always a stone-cold killer with one of the coolest gimmicks. This was not the case during his early run, as before he became the human suplex machine, Taz was actually the far less iconic Tazmaniac. Who was the Tazmaniac? Well, he was what looked to be a Savage Islander who had just arrived in the US. And we're not talking about a believable Savage here like Jacob Fatu either. No, we're talking about a more cartoon character-like version, which was less violent in its nature. Needless to say then, once ECW morphed from its early Eastern incarnation into its more well-known Extreme one, this kind of gimmick just wasn't going to fly anymore. And so that was why, following an incident where he broke his neck in the middle of the ring and then walked himself to the hospital in one of the toughest stories we've ever heard, the Tazmaniac took his subsequent time off as an opportunity to rethink his career, with him eventually deciding to come back 5 months later under the new guise of Taz. And we all know who Taz is and how he differed from the Tazmaniac. Hell, back during the early 90s, there were few figures out there in the entire industry who were considered as dangerous as he was. Yes, the story around his neck injury helped to sell this somewhat, but even more than that, it was the complete change in both his look and his attitude which made Taz succeed in a way no prior incarnation of the gimmick had done before. But it's not always about altering a pre-existing gimmick when it comes to recovering from a tough period for a performer. No, sometimes the character you have is so bad, all you can do is scrap it completely and come up with a new one. And this is exactly what happened with our next subject when he went from being Dr. Isaac Yankem DDS to being Kane instead. Now, if you were one of the people still watching WWF in the mid-90s, then you'll probably remember this one. But for those who weren't, Isaac Yankem was basically wrestling's resident dentist decades before Britt Baker came along. When it came to him, though, he wasn't interested in providing good medical services. No, all he was interested in was hurting Bret Hart. And the reason for that was because, as the supposed personal dentist of Hart's chief rival Jerry the King Lawler, this is exactly what he'd been brought into the WWF to do. Was it a gimmick that had much longevity to it? No, it was pretty bad even by the standards of the new generation era. And that was exactly why, after less than a year on the roster, the whole character would be abruptly dropped. But this didn't mean it was the end for the man behind it, Glenn Jacobs, because about a year or so later, after undergoing another terrible gimmick where he played the fake Diesel, the Spanish-born star finally got a chance to sink his teeth into something truly great when he was introduced as Kane, the secret long-lost brother of The Undertaker. That's right, one of the longest-lasting and most successful gimmicks in WWE history, Kane would be such a winner for Jacobs that even to this day, he still uses it to make cameo appearances in the Fed. And that's something which he certainly wouldn't be doing if he was still wrestling's second most famous dentist. Sure, it helped the whole thing get over that the Big Red Machine's face was hidden behind a mask for the early years of his run, meaning fans never got an opportunity to put two and two together and realize they'd already seen this guy on TV before. But even once his mask was removed, so great was the gimmick, it remained over anyway. Really, if we want to talk about great gimmick upgrades, this has to rank right up there as amongst the best ever, at least as far as the men are concerned. But let's move away from the men for a moment, and over to the women, specifically the women of AEW, as it's there we find our next subject, Toni Storm, the woman who recently went from being an outcast to being timeless. Yes, before her current incarnation, Storm had spent her time in NXT and NXT UK, where she became a one-time NXT United Kingdom Women's Champion. That said, following a pretty disastrous main roster WWE run, it seemed her confidence had been affected for a while, and this appeared to carry over to her early run in All Elite Wrestling too. Why do we say that? Well, during her first months there, Storm didn't really feel like the superstar she'd been before whilst in NXT. Of course, part of the reason for this was because she was part of the underwhelming Outcast stable, along with Saraya and Ruby Soho. But after losing the AEW Women's World title for a second time in the summer of 2023, something strange and wonderful happened. Toni began losing her mind and believing herself to be a movie starlet from the golden age of Hollywood, one who spoke only in a bizarre English accent and who was shot almost exclusively in black and white. Enter timeless Toni Storm, one of the best things going in wrestling today. Yes, to say this was an upgrade from her Outcasts incarnation would be an understatement, as now, with a character which was hugely over with fans, everything changed for the Auckland native overnight. Even today, a year into the character, it still is over as it was on day one. And with her currently in the midst of her third reign as AEW Women's Champion, a reign which, if current storylines are going in the direction we think they are, will see her get a big title match against her understudy Mariah May at Wembley later this year. There's no indication her momentum is going to slow down anytime soon. Would this have happened if she never found her timeless side? Almost certainly not. Sure, Toni has always been a great wrestler, but it wasn't until she unlocked such a brilliant character hidden within her that she truly became a star. And she's not the only woman in AEW who recently upgraded by finding a great gimmick, as the same could be said for Julia Hart in her move from Varsity Girl to a member of the House of Black. That's right, the cheerleader manager to the Varsity Blondes duo of Brian Pillman Jr. and Griff Garrison was never going to go any higher than the mid-card, and it appears she recognized this as well. Which was exactly why, after seeing what Malachi Black, Brody King, and Buddy Matthews were doing elsewhere on the show, she made a pitch to her bosses in December of that year that she'd be allowed to change things up. What would this change entail? Well, it would start with her getting an unhealthy dose of black mist to the face on the December 8th, 2021 episode of Dynamite. And after a few months of gradual shifts in both her behavior and mood then, this eventually led to her turning on the Varsity Blondes and instead taking up her role as Princess of the Black Throne. Yes, now a fully fledged member of the House of Black, Julia Hart was able to unlock a whole new side to her character, one which couldn't have been further away from the smiling, bubbly babyface she'd been before. And this worked out gangbusters for her in the end, because with her darker incarnation connecting with fans much more, it wasn't long before she was finding success as the TBS champion, a title she earned after beating then-champ Chris Statlander at November 18th, 2023's Full Gear pay-per-view. Where will Julia Hart go next? The sky's the limit, especially as she now has a much better gimmick to work with. One place she probably won't be going in the immediate future, though, is WWE. And that means we're not going to see her mix it up with our next subject anytime soon, someone who managed to revive her own career after escaping the doldrums of Reckoning by instead transforming into Mei Yim. Do we still remember Retribution, or have we all collectively blocked that one from our memories? It was pretty awful after all, Hall of Fame level bad. And one of the people who was hurt the worst by their association with this group of subpar Power Rangers villains was Mei Yim. Why was that? Well, before she became Reckoning, one of the two female members of Retribution, Yim was one of the more promising women's wrestlers on the NXT roster. But once she donned the mask and joined this group, all of her potential appeared to evaporate in the blink of an eye. Seriously, it was sad to see someone who could have been so much get so completely buried 6 feet under through no fault of her own. And that's why we're so happy that in the end, she was able to recover. And the way she would recover would be to remove the mask and, after a brief hiatus from WWE, come back to begin associating herself with the OC instead. Yes, the Los Angeles native was smart enough to realize that if she wanted to have any chance of regaining momentum here, she was going to have to get as far away from the specter of Retribution as possible. And what better way to do that than by aligning yourself with one of the best wrestlers in the world in AJ Styles? How have things worked out for the woman now going by the name of Mei Yim since then? Pretty well, as while she isn't exactly a main eventer or anything, few think of her time as Reckoning when they look at her now. No, instead they think of someone who's a great wrestler, and who has the potential to be a women's champion one day if the stars should align themselves in the right way. And considering the spot she was in only a few years ago, this can't be considered anything less than a major win on her part. But Mei Yim isn't the only person who has somehow managed to survive the disaster which was Retribution and come out of the other end still alive and thriving, as the same could be said for our next subject, the man who went from being T-Bar to being Dijak. And yes, we know Dijak had a variation of this gimmick before he was ever in Retribution. After all, it was using the Dominic Daack moniker in places like Ring of Honor and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla that he first really established himself as someone to watch, primarily through his insanely athletic big man matches with Keith Lee. That said, all of this was pretty much wiped off the board once he became T-Bar in 2020, as that gimmick was so superhumanly bad, it made everyone forget the Massachusetts native had ever been any good at all. Really, if there was ever a career killer of an angle to get tied up in, then this was it. And so that's why it's so impressive that despite being one of the key players in Retribution, T-Bar has been able to revive his fortunes so well in the years since by completely dumping the name and look, and instead returning to NXT, where he resumed things with his old moniker of Dijak once more. And Dijak is one of the most athletic big men out there, someone who, when he's given a chance to shine, can absolutely kill it in front of any crowd. Hell, this is exactly what he's done down in the developmental brand in recent months, most notably during his triple threat bout against Obafemi and Josh Briggs at April 26, 2024 Stand and Deliver. And because he was so good there, as of the 2024 draft, he's been called back up to Raw again, this time without the mask, meaning he can now show a main roster audience what he's actually capable of. Will this lead to greater success for Dijak, possibly even in the form of title wins? Anything's possible, as with fans by and large no longer associating him with Retribution now, it feels like he finally has a clean slate. But let's move away from WWE for a while again, as it's not always there that someone gets a character upgrade which changes their fortunes. No, sometimes this can happen in TNA, the very place Bubba Ray Dudley transformed into Bully Ray. Yes, during his initial run as a tag star, Bubba Ray became a multiple-time tag team champion in ECW, WWE, and New Japan Pro Wrestling. But one thing he was never able to do as one half of the Dudley Boys was find any real singles success. No, that wouldn't truly happen until he entered the Impact Zone during the mid-2000s. Sure, it wouldn't happen right away. No, at first Brother Ray, as he was then known, would continue tagging with his long-term partner Brother Devon, with the pair even winning a few more tag team titles during their early years on the roster. But that would all change in 2010, as it was here that the New York native turned heel and transformed into Bully Ray, a savage villain whose only interests were hurting his opponents and coming out of things the victor. And so, it should come as no surprise that this worked out big time for Ray then, as now a bona fide singles star, he was able to start a whole new chapter of his career, one which would allow him to become TNA World Champion on 2 separate occasions, and at points, the de facto top babyface of the entire company. Yes, it was something fans of his never expected to see, and something he probably didn't expect to happen either. Of course, it was a nice thing to watch, though, as it showed Bully Ray wasn't just someone limited to working as a great tag team act. No, he could be a great solo star, too. Even today, in fact, if you ask modern wrestling fans which version of the Dudley Boy they prefer, there's a pretty good chance a large percentage of them will say Bully Ray, the singles champion, and not Bubba Ray, the tag team specialist. And that just goes to show how successful this gimmick change was for him in the long run then, as it allowed him to add a whole new second Hall of Fame worthy character to his repertoire. That said, Bully Ray wasn't the first person to successfully segue from being a popular tag team act to a mega over singles star, as years before this, the exact same thing was happening in WCW when Scott Steiner went from being a varsity athlete to being Big Papa Pump. Shakespeare, Whitman, Joyce, all great wordsmiths, but when it comes down to it, none of them can hold a candle to the eternal poet laureate of professional wrestling, Scott Steiner. Before he was the big bad booty daddy though, Steiner started out his run as one half of a tag team alongside his brother Rick. And while this tag team was hugely successful enough to see the pair become 11-time World Tag Team Champions and one of the most heralded duos of their generation, things really reached another level for the Michigan native once he decided to fly solo in early 1998. Why was this? Well, that was the point he swallowed several bowling balls and turned himself into the most swollen, muscular creature walking the planet Earth. Honestly, 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger can look on and weep here because in terms of physical transformations, this one truly takes the cake. But it wasn't just the physical change which made Scott Steiner stand out during the late 90s and beyond, as now that he'd gone solo, he was able to get more mic time too. And this was where we really saw what he was capable of. Yes, you all know the infamous math promo, but that's only scratching the surface of the iconic promo segments Big Papa Pump was a part of here. Sure, he couldn't move in the ring like he'd once been able to, but so imposing of a presence was he now, and so unique of a character had he become, it was impossible for fans to not get behind him in a big way, with this being exactly what led to him becoming a one-time WCW World Heavyweight Champion, two-time television champion, and two-time United States champion. Honestly, if you were to do a poll of wrestling fans right now and ask them which version of Scott Steiner they prefer overall, we're fairly sure the results would almost unanimously be in favor of Big Papa Pump, as with his peaks popping and his freaks by his side, he was just too damn entertaining. And like with Bully Ray, this is doubly impressive as his Steiner Brothers incarnation was already Hall of Fame worthy in itself, good enough for him to be remembered as a legend of tag team wrestling forever. We guess back in the 90s though, people just really liked it when someone put on a lot of muscle and started acting cocky about their physique. After all, it's the same thing which happened with our next subject when he went from being Marcus Alexander Bagwell to Buff Bagwell. And what a win that was for the Georgia native in the long run, as while Marcus Bagwell did have some early promise, there was always going to be a ceiling to what he could achieve as a fairly white meat babyface. And this ceiling was as a tag team performer for the likes of Stars and Stripes and the American Males. Once Bagwell turned heel in November of 1996 though, after joining the NWO, that ceiling rose big time, as now under the new moniker of Buff Bagwell, his potential increased exponentially. Why was this? Well, now able to play into his more heelish side, Buff got under the skin of fans everywhere by showing off his physique at every opportunity and using that to make men in the audience hate him. So great was the hatred for him, in fact, at certain points he'd be amongst the most over heels on the entire roster. And considering this was a roster largely made up of heels by this point, that's saying something. Sure, he may have never won the world title or main evented any pay-per-views, but don't let that suggest this gimmick change wasn't a major upgrade from the boy from Marietta, because he was now always going to be in a prominent spot on TV going forward. Hell, he even infamously got his own mother involved in on-screen angles at one point, something which is usually only saved for upper-tier stars like John Cena or The Miz. And when WCW was bought out by WWF in 2001, Buff Bagwell would end up being one of the first names from the former company to appear on Raw. In fact, he was notably part of the main event of that show on July 2nd of that year when he faced off against Booker T. No, this one didn't result in him getting a job with the Fed, but so over was the Buff gimmick. In spite of that, he managed to continue on using it in places like TNA for a few years yet, before finally hanging up his boots once and for all. But let's move away from World Championship Wrestling and back to ECW now by looking at our next subject, a stalwart of that promotion who truly broke out from the pack when he went from being a surfer to a hardcore brawler. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Sandman, of course. Ever wonder why the Sandman had the name he did despite the fact that his gimmick was that of a hard-drinking trucker who'd somehow found his way into a wrestling ring? Well, that's because his initial character had nothing to do with this. No, back during the early days of his run with Eastern Championship Wrestling, James Fullington portrayed himself as a surfer character, one who liked nothing more than to hit the waves and then relax on the beach afterwards. Obviously then, this didn't get over too well with a 90s audience, and it didn't sit well with Fullington either, as it didn't represent who he was as a person in any way. So that's why he was overjoyed when, in 1994, then ECW boss Todd Gordon suggested he change things up and adopt a more edgy character in better fitting with both the times and with his own personality. Enter Sandman, a gimmick which, while it may have shared the name of the early incarnation, bore no resemblance to this, as now it was what we all know James Fullington for best, a bar brawler who got drunk before he ever hit the ring and who had the coolest entrance known to man. Yes, every time Metallica started playing at an ECW show, you knew you were in for a treat. And this was what led to him winning multiple titles over the course of the rest of his run there, whether that be the tag team titles or the world title. Needless to say then, such a level of success would never have been achieved if he'd remained in that early surfer incarnation, as no one wanted to cheer for a bad Beach Boys knockoff during the mid-90s. No, what fans wanted was something with some edge, something with some attitude. And that's exactly what the Sandman 2.0 gave them. But the same could be said about everyone else we've looked at today too, when it comes to giving fans of the era what they wanted, because they were each able to take what they had and, through the power of reinvention, turn it into something even greater by the time it was all said and done.